UAP evidence. But part of our statement of task is to assess the scientific analysis techniques that are available. You don't have to start it just yet. And how we might use them to determine physical constraints on UAP. The UAP reports with the most detailed contextual information are the ones from the Navy aviators, and they're using a combination of ranging and infrared imaging information. And for these cases, we can directly calculate critical parameters of a UAP, such as altitude and velocity, under certain assumptions. And it's, the main point I want to make here is that this multi-sensor approach is absolutely critical to charting a path forward for UAP investigations, and that pertains to NASA as well. So I'm going to provide one example here just to illustrate the crucial role of science and scientific analysis, and the role of scientific analysis to avoid misinterpretation in some sense. Next build. Just hit space. Yeah, okay, so this is, this video was recorded by pilots deployed from the aircraft carrier USS Theodore Roosevelt in 2015. The example has been given the nickname Go Fast because it gives an impression of an object moving very rapidly against the ocean surface. And the question is this impression correct? And if not, what can we say quantitatively about what that object is doing in kind of Earth-centered coordinate system? Fortunately, the information needed to determine the altitude and velocity of this object is contained on the display. So go ahead and next. And this includes the elevation angle of the camera, the azimuth angle of the camera, the target range in nautical miles, aircraft altitude, the time reference in seconds, indicated airspeed in knots. This information in this video in particular has been discussed quite a bit on the web. So let's begin with the object altitude. Next, please. So knowing the jet's altitude and the bearing to the target, we can apply basic trigonometry to figure out where that object is in altitude space. And it turns out to be, provided the range information is accurate, which can have some uncertainties associated with it, but the object appears to be at about 13,000 feet. An important aspect of this here is that it's sort of midway between the jet and the ocean. So it's the ocean that looks like it's right behind it is actually 4.2 miles away. And this is our first indication that some or most of the motion that we observe, the apparent motion of the object, is in fact due to the rapid motion of the sensing platform, which is about 430 miles per hour in this case. But we don't have to guess about this. So we have enough information on this display to actually reconstruct the encounter. Go to the next slide, please. And so this is what this is. This is using additional information on the screen, including the time axis. And so we know that this aircraft is banking about 15 degrees left, and you can compute through a simple calculator the approximate radius of curvature of the flight. And the bottom line is, I won't go into detail here, but if you can get the bearing and range to the target at two locations with known separation in time, you can figure out how far it moved. And in this case, this object moved about 390 meters in 22 seconds, and that corresponds to a velocity of just 40 miles per hour. And so that's a velocity that's consistent with wind speeds at 13,000 feet. So it's not our task to conjecture what this object is, but it's an example that illustrates the type of data needed to determine critical parameters that will help us identify such objects going forward. In addition to the importance of quantitative analysis, this example also serves to illustrate the kind of cognitive bias we have to contend with for UAPs recorded from unfamiliar perspectives. And Sean Kirkpatrick showed another example of that. This is a parallax effect case. Thank you. Any questions?
Thanks. Actually, before we have questions, this is actually a good moment. Sean had wanted to comment on one of the questions. If we bring Sean up and then take questions for everybody or more discussion.
Thanks. That was actually very helpful for everyone, I'm sure. Just one piece of clarification on the video that we showed, the second one that was the newly released one, had the 3 aircraft in it. The question was asked about if it was a stabilized background against which the jitter was showing. I am not 100% certain of that answer. It might just be a bunch of dust on that sensor, but let me go back and get you a more fulsome answer. It is either stabilized background or it's just garbage, but in either event, the 3 aircraft are jittering because of the platform. But that's another example of exactly what you're saying, right? It's the perception of the operator who thinks it's doing something else when it's actually just your own camera. Right.
Yeah, if I could just, Sean, in your event, it seemed to me that what you mean by jitter in this case is the plane is actually making motions that are causing a parallax.
So it's actually more than that. So the plane will move, and that'll cause the parallax that you just showed. But the sensor itself, a lot of these cameras are in gimbals. For those of you not certain what a gimbal is, it's the thing that your cameras sit on, your telescopes sit on, it moves it around in different directions. Those can sometimes be stabilized, in which case they damp out the motion of the platform. And in other cases, they're not, and they jump around. And so what you're actually seeing in that video is what we call jitter of the sensor against the platform. So the platform's moving and the sensor is moving. It's not a stabilized against the target. But once it's collected, sometimes in processing, the background is stabilized frame to frame, just like some of those TikTok videos you see, right? Same idea.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in here. I think make a couple of comments to just follow up on what Josh said. In my experience of flying, over 15,000 hours, 30-something years in airplanes and both in space, and the environment that we fly in, space or an atmospheric flight, very, very conducive to optical illusions. So I get it why these pilots would look at that go fast video and think it was going really, really fast. I remember one time I was flying in the warning areas off of Virginia Beach, military operating area there, and my Rio thought, the guy that sits in the back of the Tomcat, was convinced we flew by a UFO. So I didn't see it. We turned around. We went to go look at it. It turns out it was Bart Simpson, a balloon. Oftentimes in space, I would see things and I was like, oh, that's really not behaving like it should. It doesn't have the trajectory of a satellite or a planet on the back of the star field. And every single time when I would look at it long enough, I would realize that it was atmospheric lensing. It was the fact that what I was looking at was actually flying behind the atmosphere, and because of variations in the atmosphere, it made the trajectory look like it wasn't going in a straight line. It was going like this, and it would go like that, and it would turn in the other direction. Was always the case. My brother, Mark Kelly, a former NASA astronaut, and also now a U.S. Senator, I was with him for dinner last night, and he shared a story with me again that he had shared years ago, but I had kind of forgotten about it, and I think it's worth sharing. And that is when he was the commander of STS-124, I think it was, in 2008, they were getting ready to close the payload bay doors of the space shuttle. And before they do that, you got to make sure nothing interferes with the doors, because if the doors don't close properly, the space shuttle can't re-enter the atmosphere. It would come apart. It's part of the structural integrity of the vehicle. So they see something in the payload bay, and they thought it was a tool, maybe a bolt. They couldn't quite figure it out. They were potentially going to have to go and do a spacewalk to retrieve it. But before they did that, my brother grabbed a camera, they took a picture of it, and when they blew up the picture, they realized that this is not a bolt or a tool in the payload bay. It was actually the International Space Station that was 80 miles away. I mean, that's just a really good example of how this environment we operate in is so conducive to optical illusions. Oftentimes, guys fly into the water. I mean, there are cases where, pilots have rendezvoused on a buoy because they thought that was their wingman. It's just very, very challenging environment to work in, especially at night. And in my experience, the sensors kind of have the same issues as the people's eyeballs.
So per what Scott just said, I think we need to take it as an action to investigate unidentified animated phenomena to go after Bart Simpson. I think what Josh and Scott said is very, very helpful and shows why we need multiple sources of data. Were there radar hits? Were there other sightings? Unless we can look at this from a holistic perspective, it's very difficult to draw conclusions. And relative to stigma, and I appreciate the reports that our colleagues gave, I think there's plenty of stigma right here in this building, and I'm sure, Dan, you've suffered from it at times. And I just want to commend Administrator, although he's always be Senator Nelson to me, for his leadership and candidly courage in getting NASA to tackle this issue. And as we look at what Sean had articulated, that what he wants NASA to do, as we look at the recommendations for reporting and how we need to collate that reporting, I'm very concerned that this could be effectively done on an ad hoc basis. And I've been a part of far too many panels and studies that end up sitting on the shelf. I don't want this to be one of those exercises. And we can discuss this further, but I would call for and recommend a permanent office within NASA to support this activity, albeit likely a modest one, but to collate this information, to collate that data, to archive the information, and act as the open, forward-facing counterpart to Sean and AARO. I think then we could continue and actually accomplish the reporting, the stigma issues that have been raised, and we could do so in a relatively affordable fashion. Because again, I don't want all of our work to end up being in vain.
Good. So now Jen's going to turn to our charge.
I am.
And you know, as a panel, when we were convened with a set of questions that we were charged to address, we've been addressing them through the topics we've talked about and through things as we've been thinking this through, but we're going to organize the next part of the discussion with Jen presenting these things, and this is also a chance to get into some of the discussion phase, because we can look at each of these questions as the topics that we want to make sure we address as part of the report. Jen.
Thanks, David, and I want to thank the panelists all for all of your work, all of the knowledge that I've gained from each of you through this time. I took it upon myself in preparing for today's meeting to draft a statement that answers the 8 questions that we were provided at the beginning of the last summer when the panel was created. So I'm going to read the question out loud. I'm going to read my statement, and I'm going to pause, let you think and reflect. And if there's, remember, this isn't all of the details associated with each of these answers, right? This is to be a kind of high level, make sure we've got the major points there. And this is an initial take for these answers. So the first question goes, what types of scientific data currently collected and archived by NASA or other civilian government entities should be synthesized and analyzed prior to potentially shed light on the nature and origins of UAP? So the panel reviewed data sources, analytic tools, data architectures from NASA, NOAA, FAA, Commerce, and others. The data that we recognized were not collected for the purpose of identifying UAP, which leaves bias in the data that was collected. Even though there is an immense amount of data available, it is hard to access, and the sensors that were used were not well calibrated for identifying anomalous phenomena. No questions. Moving forward. Question number 2. I kind of feel like Jeopardy. What types of scientific data currently collected and held by nonprofits and companies should be synthesized and analyzed to potentially shed light on the nature and origins of UAP? Many organizations exist to track sightings of anomalous phenomena in the Earth's atmosphere, both nonprofit, for-profit, and otherwise. The study panel concluded that much of the inputs collected by these organizations are not considered scientific data in nature, and that they do not contain unbiased information, they're not repeatable, and they typically come with eyewitness accounts, which we've heard even today, that there's hesitations with using only eyewitness accounts to recognize or identify UAP. To the point about commercial or companies, there are a lot of space companies that some lobbied hard to get in to present to us. They have troves of data, but they're collected for a variety of different purposes than the purpose of UAP. And those systems, while they are well calibrated, are only one source of many that could be used. Questions, comments, concerns? Yes, Carla.
I'll bite on that one, Jen. You know, I think your answer is correct as to what we've seen, but where I would go is if we made a recommendation to NASA that, you know, we're really asking them to build a roadmap, and we haven't done a robust cataloging. We've looked at sources, mentioned sources that we think might be relevant, but perhaps a more robust effort cataloging would be a good modest start.
It's good. I will, only in slight defense of trying to answer the exact question as posed to the panel, rather than trying to add recommendations at this point. But yes, point well taken. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the data sets that we just learned about, heard more about today, and thinking about sort of calibrating things, is the FAA data on anomalous, tracking events, right? And I think this is something where if we had, some imaging software, people, citizen scientists with cell phone cameras identify some event that looks interesting, one of the places you'd like to be able to turn is the FAA data. And having, if there is, to go back to, having a NASA responsibility for data, NASA might, has a lot of experience in serving as a clearinghouse for data from across the government for civilian data, right? This is something we do in lots of different areas. And I think there are some opportunities with data sets there, and I think the radar data is one that comes to mind as one we don't want to forget about as an available data set.
Yeah, absolutely. Question 3, I think, goes more towards the recommendations of what other types of scientific data should be collected by NASA to enhance the potential for developing an understanding of the nature and origins of UAP. So we've heard now from 2 of the panelists on some of the information that should be collected, or the way that some of that data should be organized in a manner to make it available for people to analyze that information. And the only other thoughts that I had here was really recognizing the difference in the sensor thresholds, right? So we can't always tune a sensor all the way to the resolution that we might need or we might want. And as we collect that data, to recognize for the scientists that are doing those analyses the bounds of each of the systems that they're using. Yeah.
What strikes me on that one, when you were reading the answer, the proposed answer, was what may be new, may be something that's new to NASA in the sense of like a time series, so we can know what's normal, so we can perhaps identify what's not normal or anomalous, right? So I'm not sure to what extent it's like the most unsexy thing to sell on the face of the planet, right, is making consistent long-term observations. But I think that the agency may be set up to do just that for multiple reasons, right?
Yeah, persistent data collection.
The agency does that in a lot of cases for astrophysical purposes. So the infrastructure, of course, pointing up and pointing at a different distance, but the infrastructure for collecting this kind of data, organizing it, keeping it, and that does exist.
Yeah, and there are, in their defense, a lot of satellite companies that are doing that persistent collection as well. Question 4, which scientific analysis techniques currently in production could be employed to assess the nature and origins of UAP? Which types of analysis techniques should be developed? So this is a two-part with what exists today and what should be. So we're looking also at recommendations. Based on the information provided by the presenters to the panel, there are very few credible analysis techniques available that currently exist to assess the nature and origins of UAP. The onset of artificial intelligence and automated analysis techniques give promise to being able to do that in the future.
I wanted to add something to that perhaps, which is that really to design the analysis, you need to know what the data looks like, right?
Yes.
So, we can't really say what kind of analysis should be created on the hypothetical data that we're recommending should be collected in some,
Right.
somewhat specified fashion.
If it's all hypothetical and we want to
Right.
collect all of this data and we know what format it's going to be in, we can design analysis techniques around it.
And at that point, it's likely that there are analysis techniques that already exist. There
Absolutely.
is a wealth of anomaly detection work. We just don't know which one will be most suitable because the data, as it should be, doesn't exist yet.
Correct.
She said exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah, and that's what I was getting at with my point. Not that those analysis techniques don't exist in the scientific community, just that they're not being applied to this problem set right now, and it's hard to apply them when we don't have the known data of what would go into those. David?
Yeah, I think something we want to stress here is the importance of uniform data
Yes.
in the way it's collected, because particularly when you're looking for outliers, if you have data coming from many different observing techniques, right, and just having a uniform set of cameras, a uniform set of detectors, so you understand and characterize them, right? Because this is a needle in the haystack problem, and every camera. I'd mentioned in the opening session, ghosting in optics.
Yes.
That's going to be different in every different detector, right? And before we get to the analysis techniques, we want to make sure we design the data collection so that the analysis techniques can effectively be used on it.
Right.
David, can I take a slight issue with that, which is, it sounds like you're implying that you need a single way of collecting the data. I'd argue it's really you need to understand the various ways in which you're collecting the data and you're able to cross-calibrate across those different approaches. Because I seriously doubt that there is a single detector.
I think a handful of ways so that you're well characterized. Things need to be well characterized to be useful, I guess is the way I would state it. And it takes time and energy to well characterize things, so that's I think the challenge.
So following up on both your points, I think it's where we can actually apply artificial intelligence. So we cannot apply artificial intelligence on the current data, but we can apply artificial intelligence in a way that we can design characteristics for the data that we need and how we can collect the data that we need. So.
This is probably more of a frustration than anything else, so I don't know how helpful it'll be, but I think we're not looking for a needle in a haystack. We're looking for an anomaly in a haystack. We don't even know that we're looking for a needle.
It's just a discolored piece of hay.
Well, I'm from Montana, so I love good hay analogy. I don't know what the phenomenology is that we're looking for. We say anomalous. Again, this question earlier, what does that mean? Anomalous acceleration? I think as we try to look at the data, we're starting from an almost impossible position when if we don't know what we're looking for, is it a radiation signature? Is it something electromagnetic? Is it something like that? Is why this is so challenging and frustrating to me that we're talking about monitoring something that we don't even know what we're supposed to monitor.
And let me just offer, Josh, before you jump in, the scientific process of hypothesis-driven research, right? Of that, while we don't know all of the possible outcomes in the entire world, we can ask very specific questions and go about it in a very scientific process to understand. So you're right, we don't know exactly what we're looking for, but we know hotspots, as we've seen from both the FAA and Aero. We do know some of those conditions that we might be looking for. So if you start with kind of what you know, or places to start to go and look, and you start with the data that we have available to us, we might start being able to untangle the chicken and egg problem.
Jen, what is the phenomena that we're looking for?
So we've heard them from Sean. I would pull up Sean's chart, but I can't quickly do that. Of the criteria that he said on the trends, I use the word criteria, he said trends, of 6 or 7 phenomena, I guess, of specific size or within a specific motion range. And it's something different than what we've seen before. It's something we don't recognize. And so when you go to look for something that you don't recognize, it can be pretty easy, in that we've fooled ourselves today and even watching some of these videos of what's going on. But when you're able to corroborate that with 3 or 4 other sources, it starts to make sense. Right? So something that looks like magic to the naked eye or to that camera and that sensor isn't, once you understand all of the effects of what was going on in the surrounding environment.
So I got a question. Can we, because I got the same frustration you do, right? It's regardless of what you're looking for, if you don't know what it is, whether you're using AI or match filtering techniques, you can't find it, right? You can't find it. So because the question I have is, can we use social media, that kind of thing, as a way of cueing to know where something's happening? Because we know Google searches can lead you to better understand where outbreaks happen, right? Disease outbreaks. Can you use similar type of conflation of data to start saying, well, something's going on here, let's start cueing sensors in that area? That requires some real-time capability, but is that something we can think about?
Can I object to that just a bit? You can find things that you don't know how they look.
Okay.
There is a lot of the algorithms in anomaly detection are really based on let's find out how what we know looks like, so that anything that doesn't look like that can be identified and spotted, and then we can think whether or not we understand it, right? And so I think the point about the homogeneous detectors really is about that. We need to have a solid understanding of the normal to detect the anomalous or the outliers, as we sometimes perhaps more often call them in science, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to be cautious of time. We were supposed to end this about 10 minutes ago.
Right, so, but this is drifted into discussion, but I think we're doing discussion. So do you have any last topic you want to hit? If not, then we'll just open up to general discussion.
I have 4 more questions that we're technically supposed to answer.
All right, let's do 1.
We can
And
do
then we'll-
4 questions in 2 minutes, right? Okay,
4 and 2 minutes,
speed
yeah.
round.
Fast.
In considering all of the factors above, what basic physical constraints can be placed on the nature and origins of UAP? Mike, would you like to take this question?
Absolutely, needle in the haystack.
Okay, got it. In my notes to answer this, knew that Sean had presented some trends, so I used that kind of as the basis for what basic physical constraints could be available, and also Josh's presentation that he just presented of, we know some of these are still in the realm of understanding. We just haven't applied basic physics to understand what's there, what we have. Question 6, what civilian airspace data related to UAPs have been collected by government agencies and are available for analysis to A, inform efforts to better understand the nature and origins of UAPs, and B, determine the risk of UAPs to the national airspace? So we saw some of this I'm going to use examples from today to kind of move quickly. Some of this in Mike Free's presentation, talking about the air risks, right, that FAA is always looking out for. We know by altitude and by sensor and curvature of the earth and line of sight, and as you get higher that you can see more, right? So we have a lot of civilian airspace data that can start to understand the nature and origins of the UAP, and determining the risk is based on how much you know, right? So you think about, I go straight to space and I think about satellites, and one tiny piece of space debris can destroy an entire satellite because they're moving really, really fast in the vacuum of space. It's not necessarily so true in airspace, right? But something that we don't know could have a severe impact on pilots and their flight plan and all of that, which then could really wreak havoc on all of the United States airspace. And so being able to understand and identify what those phenomena are will help de-risk the air flight safety in the national airspace. Question 7. What current reporting protocols and air traffic management data acquisition systems can be modified to acquire additional data on past and future UAPs? We've heard a lot of the reporting structures. It was talked about earlier today. Those probably can be adapted and improved, and it's up to us in discussion as the panel on what those recommendations might be. Question 8, and I'll get off stage. What potential enhancements to the future air traffic management development efforts can be recommended to acquire data concerning future reported UAPs to assist in the effort to better understand the nature and origins of the UAPs? The potential enhancements, automatic filtering of the knowns has come up as a talking point. These are specific really to acquiring data, the tuning of those sensor platforms, the multimodal spectrum collection, and being able to kind of timestamp or geostamp each of those to corroborate the sightings. So I will leave the panel with that, with time to continue discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So, sorry. Okay, great. Let me go up to, lead this from there. But before I open it up, I just wanted to restate Federica's answer to Mike for hay. If you know the properties of hay very well, and you go through your haystack and say, I don't know what this is, but it doesn't look like hay. You don't need to have a match filter looking for a needle in a haystack if you know hay very well.
And who said NASA couldn't speak to Middle America?
Now, as a New York City resident, my impression is if you go through hay you don't want to do it with your hands. But I defer to you on yeah.
You have no choice, but AIML would be good.
Yeah, I think AM, yeah. So I want to, in the final minutes we have here before the public session, look to the future. I think a lot of us have looked at the data we have now with a sense of dissatisfaction and say, what data would you want and how would you want to collect it? And just think about, we don't need to design the detectors, but think about the characterization that we'd like, what wavelengths we'd like, and just to kind of throw that out as one way to think about what we might want to recommend. Paula.
So one thing that strikes me in that question is that I'm not totally certain that we've dedicated our time and effort to looking for anomalies. I think by default there are some science communities that look for things like the genesis of a hurricane or a harmful algal bloom in the ocean or something in interstellar space. But I'm not sure we ever focused our interdisciplinary effort on that. And I think the question you ask is a really interesting one, part of our statement of task, right? But I'm not sure I can answer that quite yet. That's how I feel about that one.
Sure.
Shelley Wright. Yeah, going along with Dr. Bontempe's point there, we heard a lot from Aero about specifics about the needle, 1 to 4 meters in size, 0 to Mach 2. You can then look at NASA's assets, right, and look at its spatial resolution, its spectral resolution, in particular the frame rate. I'm going to get to your question here, Dr. Spergel. you can look at the current NASA assets and try to say which ones could find that needle, the ones that Dr. Kirkpatrick put forward. That analysis has not been done. So one of my recommendations would be for NASA to convene a group and a task force to look at its current assets to calculate what current available data, and current facilities could answer insight into that. Now, to get to your future question, looking at this, I see Walter, is frame rate. I see a really big issue with frame rate. So if you want to catch fast-moving objects, you need to take quick images. If you want to get to these very small sizes and resolution, depending on altitude, where you're taking your image from ground or space, NASA will likely have to increase its frame rate into its detectors.
I think short answer to what NASA's current assets would be able to see would be really big haystacks that are moving very slowly, which I think is the point that you're making. But that doesn't mean that that data is not useful, because if it's able to characterize the background extremely well, that gives you a better idea of what unusual looks like. Basically, anything that you do that characterizes the background will contribute to an understanding.
So we're going to have to cut this off now, because we're now going to our public comment session. So turn that over.
Hello, everybody. I am Karen Fox with NASA's Office of Communications, and we are segueing into the public Q&A portion of this meeting. As a reminder, this is a FACA meeting, that is a Federal Advisory Committee Act, and so we are under guidance which says that these meetings are public and that we take public questions. We got hundreds and hundreds of questions, and I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you to everybody who submitted them. We're obviously not going to get to all of them today, but we are going to make attempts to answer some of them online. You can always check back to science.nasa.gov/UAP, where over time we will make it clear where we're putting up some more of those answers. In the meantime, we did have to make some decisions. We stuck to questions that applied to this independent study and UAPs. There were a lot of questions about astrobiology and other subjects that we're not going to get to today. And also, in an attempt to get to as many of the questions as possible, since so many of them were similar, we've sort of bucketed them. And that is how we're going to try to address as many as possible. So I'm going to toss the questions to you, and we'll look to getting some answers for our public questions. All right. So first set of questions are specifically about the data being used. So examples. What exactly are you incorporating into your report? What data are we using? What are some examples of data being used? Do we have multi-sensor data or of objects performing maneuvers that seem truly anomalous? Do we have photos, videos? What about having the NASA historian go through the NASA's historical records? Did you interview military or pilots for this study? So looking for some information about the kinds of data. I can toss to anyone. David looks like he's jumping in.
Well, I think first and foremost, our goal here is really to create a roadmap, right? So really, we have been informed by some of the events that are reported, and we've had, but we've certainly not done a complete historical study or in an archive. And I think one of the things we've wanted to do was learn what kinds of events have been reported, learn about some of the ones that have been resolved, some of the ones that are unresolved, so we can best think about how in the future we can collect data so that we can get more robust answers. So that, I hope that addressed that question.
It does.
Others have anything else they'd like to add?
All right. Then I will keep going. Another big question category was about transparency and about sharing information. And so examples in this category are, what is NASA hiding and where are you hiding it? How much has been shared publicly? Has NASA ever cut the live NASA TV feed away from something? Has NASA released all UAP evidence it has ever received? What about NASA astronauts? Do they have an NDA or clearance that does not allow them to speak about UAP sightings? What are the science overlords hiding? Dan Evans.
All right, I'll take a stab at that one. I really want to assure the public and to double down on some remarks I made this morning that this agency is absolutely cast iron committed to openness and transparency and honesty. And that commitment also extends to our live NASA TV feeds. They provide real-time footage from our various missions. Now, to my knowledge, NASA has never intentionally cut a live feed to hide anything, and that includes UAPs, of course. Sometimes there are interruptions to our feeds, but that is simply because space is a complex place. There's a vast array of natural phenomena, human-made objects, and so forth. But again, I wanted to reassure the public that we're absolutely committed to providing the public transparency and openness. Those are the hallmarks of NASA. That's why we're here today in public on TV, because we want the public to have the opportunity to see the process of this committee doing its work in public. It's only right.
Just to follow up on what I said, I didn't mean to joke about it, but in my 20 years at NASA, no one, either officially or unofficially, in my recollection, have ever discussed or briefed us or had any kind of discussions about anything that would be considered a UAP or UFO or anything like that.
And I'll ask you to stand for 1 second and state your name. I'll ask you to stand for 1 second and state your name, just so everybody know who was speaking. It's hard to see in the back.
Kelly. I'm just following up on the question about if NASA astronauts ever signed an NDA or anything of that, anything like that. In my experience of being in the astronaut office for 20 years, there was never any formal or informal discussions at all about UAPs or UFOs or anyone reporting anything that would suggest something from, beyond our planet.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Just want to make a quick comment about the culture of science in relation to this question. Scientists by nature are at least intellectually sort of rebellious. It's in our nature to question authority. That's how you're a good scientist. You don't just take someone's word for it. You try to discover the truth. And for that reason, this question about what are the science overlords hiding, that's sort of written in a facetious way. But I just want to emphasize that there's no way that all scientists could be in on trying to hide something, because it's just not in our nature. If somebody told me to try to hide something as a scientist, that would just increase my desire to belay that order and to release it. And I think that's true of our community in general.
All right, thank you so much. I am going to go on to our third set of questions, which is, has NASA been tracking Earth's atmosphere, or are we also studying bodies of water for UAP? And I think that's a Dan question for NASA, or?
Is that a me question?
Yep.
Oh.
Here's the oceanographer. My understanding is this is a completely independent study to assess what assets, what data, what science, what observations, platforms NASA has to potentially help evaluate and understand UAP, right? We have, NASA has an Earth Science division and many scientists at many centers and many academics and other partners out there that study the Earth as a system. We do this from the unique vantage point of space, and the atmosphere is part of that. I think Dr. Kirkpatrick stated this morning that to his knowledge, and I think to ours, there isn't anything that's been reported below the ocean surface, and so I think part of what we've been talking about all day is, what assets are out there to actually begin to identify data that could be useful in explaining any of these reports if and should they come in. So I think that's probably it, unless there's something else to add.
All right then, thank you. Moving on to our fourth general bucket of questions. What are you doing to solve the stigmatization surrounding the study of UAP?
I can take that one.
And state your name if you wouldn't mind first.
Carlin Toner, FAA. I think the fact that NASA has called us together here as a panel to look into this, that NASA is hosting a public meeting, that we've heard, right, it clearly stated we're here to be transparent. I think that's the first step in trying to really normalize the study of UAPs. And we talked a little bit earlier about the reporting, about how to make it credible. And we talked also about UAP in one of the earlier talks this morning of the definition of the A, whether it was aerial or anomalous, as the legislation now is. And really the distinction beyond UFOs, right? When we're looking at UAPs here, we're beyond just airplanes. We're looking at all types of anomalous phenomena. And so that's just a more inclusive term there.
Yeah, still Mike Gold. Just wanted to emphasize what Carlin said, which is so accurate. I really consider it quite amazing that we're here having this discussion. NASA leadership deserves great kudos for this. And beyond, I think a recommendation that I'd like to make is that NASA participate in symposia, in panels, sponsor research. When you have the NASA logo on that sponsored research, on the discussion, it really helps normalize and push back against the stigma. I think NASA can leverage its excellent reputation, both domestically and abroad, to help push back on that stigma. And I think it's important to do so not just for science and discovery, but for national security. That we've all seen what's occurred with balloons from rival nations. We don't want this stigma to be a vulnerability that rival nations can take advantage of.
Yes, Dan?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. Just a few additional points from the agency perspective. We are, of course, taking a set of actions to effectively normalize the study of UAPs, and that involves collaborating across the government, encouraging an open dialogue, and promoting rigorous scientific inquiry. Let me turn to each of those in turn. So in terms of promoting a rigorous scientific inquiry, the primary way we're doing this is by being truly rigorous and employing an evidence-based methodology in everything that we do. That is characteristic of scientific research. It's no accident that the people up on this stage are true experts in their respective fields, okay? So that is in turn going to help us to legitimize UAP studies. Encouraging open dialogue. So by holding public meetings such as this one and having open conversations about findings, then we're helping to normalize discussions again. And that really goes arm in arm with our commitment to openness and transparency with the public. And then finally, in terms of collaborating across the government, we're working very closely with other government agencies, not least Sean's office, Aero, to broaden the scope and the depth of our study. And I honestly believe that this collective interagency approach will lend credibility to the study of UAPs, and it's going to demonstrate the seriousness with which we're approaching this issue. Thanks.
Well, that segues very nicely into what our next set of questions are, which is who we are working with. So the question is, who else is NASA currently working with, or do we want to work with to study UAP? And is NASA working with international partners?
All right. Pete, do you want to do it?
I'll take a stab at it.
Okay.
As the questions tasked to this panel so kindly asked us, both in what other government agencies are collecting data, what data is available. NASA is partnering with them in many ways, as well as NASA has a wide commercial outreach and partnerships with understanding what data is available, as well as NASA's founded on well, not founded, but the core principles of NASA are with international partners. So the information that our partners are gathering is typically available to NASA as well. So
Michael,
yes, on all accounts.
And I may just emphasize and add that NASA is singular, I believe, among government agencies in its international outreach. Again, not to keep talking about the Artemis Accords, but you see countries like Saudi Arabia that we may not have a great relationship with as a government right now. We have Saudi Arabia and Israel in the Accords family, so that NASA is unique in its scope and ability to reach out. I also think that we're entering a new era of commercial space transportation that is going from low Earth orbit out to cislunar space. And that is going to be the purview of the Department of Commerce, which is taking over space traffic management. So I think it's very important that NASA work with and support commerce as we go through that transition. Department of Defense is currently responsible for that. And I think that will help us not only to identify potential UAPs, but to assist in preventing contention, congestion, and eventually conflict. And I also want to note, in terms of space debris, debris in orbit right now, I believe, represents an existential threat to our very society, that we are getting very close to an event that could cause real problems for our ability to access satellites. And that's why I think there's great ancillary benefits to the conversation we're having today, that as we increase our capability to monitor orbit for UAPs, that data could also be very relevant as we look at near-Earth objects and other threats. And again, to just end on near-Earth objects, Apophis, for example, an asteroid, is going to come so close to Earth, it will be below geosynchronous satellites. So any effort to begin to catalog and do better in terms of understanding that environment is going to be terrific, and I hope NASA works with commerce and international agencies on Apophis and other missions.
I think Federica had something to say, too.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, you know, a lot of the things that we think we might recommend in terms of platforms to collect data that would be useful to study UAPs, you know, we recommend a multi-platform and multi-site. That would also mean likely ground-based as well as space-based facilities. And this is being done already in astrophysics, co-observing the sky from the ground and from space with different methodologies and different instruments to get a more comprehensive picture of what's normal and then detect what's anomalous. And about every 10 years, the astrophysics community anyways, but many other branches, convene a panel of experts to see what things can be done to advance the field in the next decade. It's called the decadal survey for us. And one of the recommendations this year was explicitly for agencies that do astrophysics to work together. So NSF, DOE, and NASA to work together, share data, share facilities and instruments. So I think this is, you know, there's a lot of fields will benefit from this, including the UAP studies.
Oh, absolutely.
Carlin Toner, I'd like to put an exclamation point on how well NASA is collaborating across the government. I'm from the FAA, and I can personally attest that, you know, FAA and NASA have a robust engagement in transferring research into practice in the ATM system. I think on the commercial space side, we work well with NASA. And all of our agencies are in the whole of government approach, supporting Aero specifically on the UAP topic. And you know, it really comes down to good government and how we deliver, because we can each work our own mission space, but to cover the whole space, we need to collaborate together.
And Dan?
To put an exclamation point on Carlin's exclamation point. So I think it's important to say that, you know, we really do have a good relationship with the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, Aero, Sean's office, and its previous or predecessor organization, the UAP Task Force. And we have really benefited from very fruitful collaborations among those various entities. And quite frankly, as a taxpayer, one should expect nothing less than the government to be working effectively across different units together. It's only right. That being said, it's also important to acknowledge what NASA's perspective is in this study, and to acknowledge that, you know, the Department of Defense, the intelligence community have massively different equities about the study of UAP, and they have different interests. Ours is a purely scientific one. So, you know, we collaborate, we consult. It's a very good relationship. And I agree wholeheartedly with Carlin that a whole of government approach is absolutely the right one to take.
Great, thank you. I will move on to our sixth bucket of questions, which we had many on this topic. Is there evidence that UAP were created from non-human intelligence?
All right.
Yes, please.
I will take this one. First and foremost, we are scientists, and we follow the scientific process. And I hope that the gathering here today showed a little bit of a glimpse on how the scientific process works. It's not a question that you can answer very quickly with yes or no. And we follow the data, right? So as scientists, we follow the data, we formulate hypotheses, we test theories, we follow the scientific process. The role of this panel has been to create a roadmap and a framework for how all scientists that are interested in this phenomenon can further study, can further collect data, can further formulate experiments, again, hypotheses, can test different methods, maybe even innovate on the methodology side of things, come up with new methods for how we can do basically science, but not just any kind of science, but the science of discovery and exploration, which is basically in the spirit of NASA. So just like Carl Sagan was saying, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. We cannot make that kind of extraordinary claims at all for any kind of big subjects in science, whether it's UAPs, whether it's biosignatures, whether it's technosignatures. This question of whether we are alone in the universe is probably one of the largest questions that we've had in our history of science, in our history of humanity, and it's not one that we can take lightly, and that's why we need so many scientists and multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary teams to work together, and many organizations. So it's a process, it's a roadmap, and we work collectively on this, and we hope that within our lifetime we will be able to answer this big question of whether we are alone or not, and also to better characterize this phenomenon, which is UAPs. So.
I want to sort of supplement that excellent answer by noting that we have not seen the extraordinary evidence, right? I mean, in a sense, to give, to make the claim that we see something that is evidence of, non-human intelligence would require extraordinary evidence, and we have not seen that. I think that's important to make clear.
All right, then, I will move on to our seventh set of questions. We received many questions about the budget that is being dedicated to this. How large of a budget will NASA allocate? How large of a budget is NASA allocating? And how large of a budget will NASA allocate towards the study of UAPs? Dan?
Yeah, that's a Dan question. So there are two separate questions in there, which is, what is the budget for this group, this team, and what is the budget going forward, I think. Now, the budget for this independent study team is very consistent with any other of our external review groups that we bring into the Science Mission Directorate on an annual basis. So, we have maybe 100, 200 such groups, entirely consistent with that. Also important to say, going forward now, that NASA has not established a program relative to UAP. And as a result, there's no associated programmatic funding. But this is how NASA works. Federal budgeting is a complex journey, of course, and the way NASA, particularly NASA Science, likes to work is we anticipate and wait recommendations from independent groups such as this one, and we need to wait on final recommendations, and then we'll make an assessment. So too early to say, but of course that's all couched in the fact that federal budgeting is a very complex process, and we will always follow the law.
All right, we're making good time. We have one more question that encompassed many of the ones we got, which is, has NASA encountered any aliens or extraterrestrial life? What happens if the public comes across extraterrestrial life? What would NASA do if extraterrestrial life was discovered? What would NASA study or do if extraterrestrial life was discovered? Now, I think it's worth making a distinction that when we talk about extraterrestrial life, we do have a study within NASA of astrobiology, which is not intelligent life necessarily. And so I invite you, as you answer this question, to make clear the distinctions as you are talking in terms of UAPs as well as any astrobiology work that we do.
I would start by saying one of NASA's big questions is there life out there, right? And a lot of what NASA's doing in its exploration of the solar system and beyond is focused on searching for life in any form, extraterrestrial life. I think one of the things we have learned in the past 20 years is planets are common. We knew, of course, about the planets in our solar system, but we now know there are lots of planets out there. So there are lots of potential environments for life. And I think one of the most fascinating questions is, do any of those planets host life? And that's something that NASA is trying to address in a host of different ways, whether it's probes that are landing on planets or designing missions that will look for signatures of life around other planets. So the search for life is a really important theme. We haven't found life beyond Earth yet, right? I mean, let's be clear about this. We haven't found it yet. But we're looking, and we're looking for it in lots of different ways. And, you know, David was discussing technosignatures as one way that we can look both within our solar system and beyond. And there's a lot of different elements, I think, of this potential search. And, you know, just to go back to something that was phrased in an earlier question, you know, is NASA hiding anything about this? No. This is actually what, you know, answering this question is one of the things that NASA as an agency is excited about. It's something that lots of scientists working with NASA are excited about is this question of, is there life out there? You know, and I think one of the things that makes this question of are we alone such a central question, not just to the scientific community, it's a central question, I think, for the public. I suspect there are more people watching this than the typical episode of NASA TV, right? And this is something where we will have media coming to the press conference because these questions touch on something that I think is really a deep question for humanity is, are we alone in the universe?
Yeah, just to kind of echo what David said a bit, I mean, obviously this is something we think a lot about in astrobiology. What if we succeed? And we are very driven to try to find real evidence of extraterrestrial life. And we would be highly driven to share that if we found it, because everyone wants to show that they've been able to succeed in what they're trying to do. And one perhaps illustrative example is to think about what happened when we came close, when NASA thought maybe they had discovered extraterrestrial life. And a big event, actually, in the history of astrobiology was in the 1990s when some scientists had thought that they had discovered fossils in a meteorite that came from Mars. And what happens is you don't announce it immediately. You make sure that you try to make sure you're right, because you also don't want to have false alarms and announce something and then you go, oops, sorry, we were wrong. That was a mistaken analysis. But what happened was when the scientists were sure they were right, then there was a big, in fact, presidential press conference with President Clinton and NASA, and it was a big public announcement. And that's what would happen. If we discovered something, we would try to make sure we were right, and then we would very proudly and loudly let the public know about it.
Thanks. We have just 1 minute left, so I'll let you finish up.
Yeah, thank you. The only thing I wanted to add, I wouldn't at all liken it to alien or extraterrestrial life, but in astrobiology and exobiology, there is the exploration of our planet as an analog for what might be found on other worlds, and what is extreme cold, what is extreme heat, a volcano, a black smoker at the bottom of the ocean, what lives there, and how is that even possible? And things we still discover throughout our ocean might look alien to a lot of people, right? And we keep discovering new species of different things, whether they be microbes or algae or, charismatic megafauna, whatever they are. But there are synergies. I know there was an initiative years ago at NASA called Oceans Across the Solar System, and the idea was, could our own Earth's ocean be used and the life within it as an analog for what might be discovered elsewhere? So I think that's an example of a potential synergy of interdisciplinary science, research, observations, et cetera, collection of data and information gathering that could be useful in the future.
Thank you all so much. I will hand it back to David Spergel, your chair.
So let me also just answer the one other piece of that question was, what do you do if you see something surprising? Right? Where do you report? And this is something where, just to come back to something I mentioned in my opening remarks, the AARO is our lead agency for UAPs. And while we've talked about life in this context, most UAPs, I think when one looks at the data in more detail, are going to turn out to be phenomena we understand. We saw this with some of the balloons or commercial jets. We saw those examples. Some UAPs, and we saw this with the Chinese balloon that flew over, is an issue sometimes of national security. So we actually do want to encourage people, just from that angle, to report it. So, before we'll transition to summary, but so I want to answer on that question, that, to keep in mind that, the AARO's role is to be the prime source for understanding those things. And what our charge is to think about what's NASA's role. And I think NASA, and this is something, I want to now go back to discussion. We didn't have that much time for it. Just to come back to, what we see as NASA's role in this. I think one piece we've talked about is NASA can help remove the stigma. NASA can draw more of the scientific community in. And I think what NASA can help do is provide standards of high data quality. I think one of the things that many of us who've not looked at this before, I'd certainly put myself in this group, was struck by the limited nature of the data, that many events had insufficient data, and that in order to get a better understanding, we will need to have high quality data where we understand its provenance, data from multiple sensors. And I think one of the things that's, even from the same sensor, as we saw, in Josh's analysis, also in the event Sean showed us, when you can observe an event over time and get velocity information, that gives you a lot of additional information. So we're going to want things with high frame rate. We're going to want things from multiple perspectives. So I think those are all going to be pieces of things that we want to think about. I think this is an opportunity for citizen science. I think if we can come up with recommendations in our roadmap that point to ways in which we could people can collect data. I remain a big fan of these things. They do take over our lives too much, but they are fabulous data collectors and I don't know, there's something like 3-4 billion of them that are on the planet, and NASA, I think, has the prestige and visibility to develop an app or work with companies to develop apps that could collect data in a uniform and centralized way that I think will, most of the stuff that's collected is going to turn out to be commercial planes, balloons. When you have multiple cameras, you can eliminate some of the optical limitations of ghosting and those effects. Some of them will almost certainly be novel physical phenomena, right? I think it is, we have learned a lot about our planet and how the universe works. There's a lot we don't know, right? I think, you know, as scientists, what is the most exciting thing is the surprises. And I think that there are things that continue to surprise us about our own planet. There's phenomena in our atmosphere and the ionosphere that we probably haven't seen yet, or perhaps we've seen and not noticed yet, right? And there's, I think, a long history in science when you look back and you realize that this discovery had a pre-discovery. So people had seen something before and were missing it. And those pre-discoveries were not of note, often because we had biases against seeing it, but often because there was limitations in data quality. And, you know, one of the things I was taught is when you have a question you don't know how to answer, you start by getting better data. And, you know, we're coming, you know, I get to do the summary, and as the chair, I get to, you know, summarize a conclusion. And we need better data, would be my takeaway. And we need more uniform data. And since I'm so proud of my haystack, we need to be able to understand what's in the haystack. And it's a lot more complicated than a haystack in a sense, right? Is, you know, it's got commercial planes, it's got, you know, drones, and, you know, I think the number of drones out there is large and growing and will be a continual source of confusion. We were charged to think about air safety. You know, understanding and characterizing and seeing what's going on with drones is also, I think, going to be an important air safety issue. So we'll need to, you know, to understand the unknown, or to start to study the unknown. Another important piece is always going to be characterizing the known really well. And, you know, this is the part, I think, of a lot of science that seems dry and boring, but it's calibration and understanding the events you expect to see. You know, in thinking about this area, one of the groups of people that people talk to are particle physicists doing experiments at CERN, where they go through the effort of finding extremely rare events to find new particles. And in order to do that, you need to understand the standard predictions well. So I think another part of the whole story, and I know this is something AARO is working hard on in the context of military, it's like you've got to characterize what the known things are. You know, when you've got that F-35 flying past a balloon, what does it see? What does it see at sunset? What does it see at odd observing angles? And that characterizing the normal is an essential thing to do to understand what's out there. So let me conclude the session by thanking the panelists. It's been a pleasure learning from you. Thanking our Sean and our other invited speakers and that we've had for our, some of our data collection sessions. We've learned a tremendous amount from you. And also thank the public for their engagement. I think we were all impressed by the number and level and sophistication of the questions people sent in. We tried to address as many of them that we could in the session. As you heard, NASA, through science.nasa.gov, will provide, there'll be some additional answers provided. Encourage you to go there. Actually, as a non-NASA employee, I'll put in a little ad for science.nasa.gov. NASA does amazing things, and we're learning amazing things about the universe and our planet and just encourage you to go there and continue to learn and continue to explore. So thank you all.
We are going. The history of this agency is marked with broken barriers, once viewed as impossible, with science fiction turned reality, with innovations that have spun industries all their own, and with demonstrations of peace for all humankind.
We soar in the skies of our home planet. We maintain a human presence just outside of gravity, and we touch points all across the solar system and beyond. We're going back to the moon, and this is why.
The moon is a treasure trove of science. It holds opportunities for us to make discoveries about our home planet, about our sun, and about our solar system.
The wealth of knowledge to be gleaned from the moon will inspire a new generation of thought and action.
Without fail, every major program and mission NASA has invested in has led to technologies and capabilities that have shaped our culture.
The breakthroughs of the Artemis era will define our generation and the generations to follow.
The tens of thousands of jobs associated with propelling us to the moon today are just the beginning of a lunar economy that will see hundreds of thousands of new jobs develop around the world.
This is not an ambition of one entity or one country. The exploration of the moon is a shared effort,
woven together by a desire for the greater good.
Why the moon? Because the missions of tomorrow will be sparked by the accomplishments of the Artemis generation today.
Because the ambition to go has already begun.
and because Mars is calling. We need to learn what it takes to establish a community on another cosmic shore. So let's camp close before pushing out.
And so, we go to the moon now, not as a series of isolated missions, but to build a community on and around the moon capable of proving how to live on other worlds.
We'll use the lessons from more than 50 years of peaceful exploration to send a new generation to the lunar surface to stay.
We will anchor our efforts on the lunar South Pole to establish the Artemis Base Camp, positioning us for long-term science and exploration of the lunar surface.
We will prove